This episode is brought to you by Facebook. So you were scrolling on Marketplace, and there it was, the bike you'd been searching for. You sent a message, and it turned out the seller was super chatty, kind of funny, and an avid cyclist. The next thing you know, you're in a cycling crew. Well, a community cycling group. The thing about Facebook, you might find more than what you're looking for. From a browse to a bike ride, this summer find more on Facebook.
And I actually think that there are many. This is very, very vague and abstract, but I think there are actually many situations, many ways, many contexts in which being more reflective, engaging in more critical thinking, pausing to ask why, really trying to understand your own thought better, how the reasons in your own thinking connect is very practical, and actually far from being in tension with it is actually in the long run likely to lead you to more practical outcomes than people might suspect.
Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. It's Andrew. I am so excited to let you all know that we are now in the top 40 best liberal arts podcasts list that got sent to me, and we're number 3. So thank you all for listening to the podcast. And I just really appreciate that you keep spreading the word. So please make sure you follow us on social media. Instagram is Ivory Tower Boiler Room, TikTok, Dr. Rimby. And please review us on Apple, Spotify. It really, all of it helps. So I hope you just enjoy this episode. And as always, remember, there is an ad-free version on our Patreon. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. It's Dr. Andrew Rimby with an exciting author from Broadview Press, a political philosophical expert. I am so excited to have on here Dr. Stephen Simon, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law at the University of Richmond, where his research focuses on issues around legal, political, and normative theory, which I have some questions definitely about what normative theory is, and how that differs from like counterculture theory, maybe. But we're here to talk about his new book called Why Does Anything Exist?, which is a question that so many of us have asked ourselves. So I'm so excited to have him on, and, for you to bring your political, philosophical mind to the podcast. So, welcome onto the show, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I'm really, really excited to be here. And in general, I really appreciate what you're doing with your show, with your podcast. I think it's really cool. I love the topics you get into.
Well, thank you. Well, I always love to ask anyone who is a philosopher, philosophical adjacent in their work, like, how did you get into the idea of philosophy? Like, is this something that you just gravitated towards as a child, or is this something like that kind of you started to really get into the field during your college work?
Yeah, it's funny that you mention as a child, because I don't know why, but for some reason, one of my really early memories is of having conversations with two of my best friends when I was a kid. And we would just kind of, I don't remember exactly how the conversations went, but we would kind of be outside and looking up at the stars and just kind of musing about the kind of stuff that kids talk about. And I remember there was one question in particular that kind of blew my mind even then, which was going to sound silly, but it was about, like, does space, like, if you just went in a rocket ship and went out into space and just kept going and going, would you ever come to an end? And I just remember, like, even at that age, obviously we didn't have philosophy knowledge or anything, but just that question of, like, if you just kept going and going, would you, like, run up against a wall? Like, would it be like we're in a box and you just bump up against a wall? Or would it just go on forever? And I remember the thing that blew my mind about that question was it seemed like it had to be one or the other. Like, you'd either bump into something or you wouldn't, but either answer seems like I couldn't get my head around. Like if there was a box and you ran into a wall, then it'd be like, well, what's on the other side of the wall? Right. And
Mm.
if if it just went on and on and on, something about that just doesn't seem right. Like there has to come to something at some point. So anyway, that I just remember even at a very young age, that idea of a question that seems like it must have an answer, but any possible answer doesn't seem like it can be right. And that just kind of that kind of fascination. So I did have some of the, that idea even when I was very young. But then just sort of jumping ahead, yeah, in college, to make this brief, I was very interested for some reason in rights,
Mm.
like individual rights, like where's the line between what government can do legitimately and make people do and what, like where, how to, and something that really fascinated me philosophically and has, maybe we'll get into this more later, but something that still interests me very much is like, if we do have rights, where do they come from? Like that
Mm.
going all the way down to the basics, like what, we have this feeling of like, wait, you can't do that. I have a right, but why? Like, where does that come from? So that kind of philosophical question has interested me very much as I went to college and after college and so forth.
Well, and with America's 250th anniversary, I keep thinking about like the line of inalienable rights. Like, what does that even mean? And what does that mean in terms of identities that weren't during the revolutionary period given agency, but yet like the hypocrisy of a document that's supposed to represent the demos or like the people in America, and how like the American people have continuously amended or like included more and more groups to, I guess, this living and breathing document. Like, is it as simple of a fact, Stephen, that like to the general public, I think they think philosophy is this really out of their ordinary language or is something that's really lofty or like is maybe because of jargon or the way that philosophy gets talked about. But like what you're saying is it's as simple as the fact of like thinking about, well, why does this phrase exist? Like, what does that mean? Like, just asking really inquisitive questions and, like, what is it like looking up at the sky and seeing the stars? Like, or I just saw Interstellar and there's so many questions to ask about, which I thought was amazing. The film was incredible. But, like, I even was just thinking, well, what would it be like to live in another planet on a spacecraft while you're like family and friends are just getting old rapidly. Like it's just hard to like really understand these questions without like breaking them down. And that's where a philosopher enters, right? Is to like break down these concepts.
Yeah, I like in answer like to your question about like so I think that's really true that it can seem to a lot of people the term philosophy feels intimidating. I feel like in often in everyday conversation, like you use that word and it feels very like highfalutin. Like all of a
Hmm.
sudden you've like departed normal conversation when you introduce a term like that. And I guess I feel like you were kind of alluding to this, and I very much agree with the idea that if you just put that kind of term aside and like put aside for a moment like the fancy names, it can be Immanuel Kant and these names, it's like so many thinkers and who can keep track of all this, it can be very intimidating. But just on an everyday level, I feel like I mean, I can't speak for other people, but just my sense is that it's very common to have very basic questions. And to me, that's kind of what it comes down to is having basic questions. So there's like a couple examples of things that like if you just don't use that word, but that
Hmm.
people really do think about this stuff is like if you come out of a movie, right, and you're having a conversation with your friend, and you feel really strongly that this movie was much better than, let's say, like the first one was much better than the sequel, right?
Hmm.
And people have like a really strong opinion about that. But then if you ask people, like, but then you might have a conversation about, well, like, but is it really better or is it just like my opinion?
Hmm.
Like, And I feel like that's the kind of conversation that probably a lot of people can relate to is like, wait a minute, is it just my opinion? Like, is this book really better than this other book? Or, and on what, and I guess this is again that kind of either answer seems like it can't be right because on the one hand, people, like I say, people have these like very strong opinions about like this one is better than that one. But on the other hand, is it like really in some sense like just absolutely true that one movie like what would that even mean? And so that's one example. And just very briefly, I feel like another kind of question like that is about things like justice. Like let's say you look at another country and they have a kind of a law or a policy or a practice. And of course, this happens in your own country too, but just to use that as an example, and there's something which might seem very different from what you're used to, and it feels like that field might feel very unjust or like not fair or something. And but then there's like that question of, well, is it like, does everyone just have their own opinion? And so there can be lots of different ways of thinking about it. And who am I to say that like one way is better than another way? And I feel like there's this real paradox that comes up so often, which is we seem to have really strong opinions, but then if you step back and ask people, well, do you really think that there's just one right answer? They'll say, well, no, 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 no. And so like, how do you square that idea that you have such strong opinions that you'll argue for about hours, having a drink with a friend you feel so strongly about, but then you can't quite get, just something that makes you very reluctant to say, well, yeah, there's one right answer that I know
Mm.
is the only right way to think about it.
Well, and if philosophy teaches us anything, there's never one right answer. And like, I always like, how are you weighing in right now with the 250th anniversary as someone who writes and studies political philosophy, as a political philosophy scholar, that there's so much literature right now coming out? I mean, every time I'm in Barnes and Noble, it's like I'm always excited to see, oh, what's going to be the new book that is now being published that ties into the revolution and like turning the tables on this American imperial project. And I'm sure you've seen like all these books coming out. But right on the other side, there's also those who are trying to censor those perspectives, who want to show the colonial mission and like honor America without its gray area, with, I guess, preserving like the white uh American nationalist perspective. So like, how do you weigh in on this and what's going on?
Yeah, so yeah, so you've hit on this a couple different ways, and it's such a important, interesting question, which is the way I hear it is it's about foundations, right? And you could think about the foundations of anything, including a country. And so when you think about like we live in this community, right? We live in we call this, place the United States of America. It's a specific country. It has its own laws and its history and its traditions and all that. And you, it's like, well, what's the basis of it? What's the foundation of it? How did it get here? How did it become what it is? And, I think what you're really hitting on is this really troubling question of how do you reckon with the fact that in the foundations it's like in the DNA of that basis is really bad, terrible things that no one wants to have anything to do with today,
Hmm.
right? So but you know, but obviously there's some good things that and so how do you deal with a situation where the roots of something that in some ways you very much feel a part of, you are a part of, you want to make the best it can be now, but when you go all the way back to the root, the ground, there are things there that are really troubling. And if I could, I just want to briefly tie this in with a philosophical question I was sort of touching on before, which is the basis of rights. And this is another one of these. Uh, this is actually the question that my dissertation was about. Is um, when we talk about individual rights,
Hmm.
are they ultimately, so there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it, but just in very general terms, two basic ways of thinking about it are that the reason we have rights are based in things to do specifically with this country, right? Like this country's true, like the reason that you have, let's say you have a right to a jury trial or you have a right to free speech or something like that is because you come from a particular place where particular people have been committed to that for a long time. It's in the specific history and tradition of a particular place. Or do we have rights because for universal reason? Like, no, it's not because you come from that. It's because you're a human being. And just as a human being, as a particular type of creature, you're entitled to, right? That's the inalienable rights that's in the Declaration, speaks in that language, right? And so, again, there's something very appealing about both of those answers, but they also, either way of looking at it has difficulties. And you've hit on the big problem with, or a big problem with thinking that rights come from the history and tradition of a particular country or particular place is then what do you do with the fact that there are all of these really terrible things in the history of that particular place?
Yeah, well, and I feel like with, say, the founding fathers, they were so indebted to the ancient Greek thinkers and, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the big three. And it's interesting because I feel like, in a way, the founding fathers were really deep, I mean, complex and fallible, as a lot of, thinkers are, but they also were such well-read. I mean, they had access to literature, to education, with social class, but they also were really interesting because they valued critical thinking and thought. And I was kind of wondering, preparing to talk to you, Stephen, do you feel like philosophers and philosophical thinking, which I think critical thinking is, deeply philosophical, is it being valued right now in America? Like, are philosophers and the field of study of philosophy, is it treated as something that the founding fathers held to such a high esteem? Or have we kind of lost our way when it comes to philosophy as a study, which also, in my opinion, means we've lost our way with critical thinking and reasoning?
Yeah, wow, that's a really great big question. I won't try to sort of try to answer that in full. But well, one thing that comes to mind when you talk about that is um, the idea of being are you willing to question the things that are often taken for granted and asking what the reasons are behind the things that you do and the things that you believe. And to me, like again, like sometimes terms like critical thinking or can even a term like that can be a little bit intimidating, but just in very basic terms, to me it's just looking for reasons. Like
Mhm.
you believe something, you do something, and you just ask the question and but you reflect on it, but you be intentional and reflective about it and pause let's think about it. Let's think about why do we do this? Why do we believe this and so forth? And I assume, you and I are probably very similar in this respect that we really enjoy that and consider that really important. But yeah, I think there are sometimes contexts in which that's not taken as well. And I don't want to say, but maybe part of it is that if you are asking questions about the reasons and trying to really understand the reasons why you believe something or doing something, that it might come across like you're hostile to it, right?
Mm.
Like, so, if you ask, well, why? It's like, oh, so you don't, and then it might give the impression that you're against something that everyone's supposed to be so strongly for. How dare you?
Hmm.
And I think that that might be part of why you sometimes get resistance to critical thinking and pressing, and you mentioned Socrates and just, that's the going all the way back to the roots of philosophy, right? That's how he got in trouble, that's what he did. He went around and asked people questions about things that everybody just took for granted and said, look, I'm not saying it's wrong. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Let's see. And maybe it'll turn out that it's right. And maybe talking it through and asking for reasons will just make you understand your own view better. But that there's so much value to pausing to reflect about things.
And it's so funny because I feel like the trials of Socrates and like his demise and how he questions society, as you've said, Stephen, is like an element that doesn't get talked about a lot. Like I feel like Socrates is held to this really has kind of been mythologized, right? As any, I guess, ancient figure, like even Caesar, and I mean, all the things that he also uh, was fallible and I mean, there's a reason the senators went after him. Not saying it's right. I mean, this was a long time ago, but it's so interesting what gets remembered. And I mean, do you feel like philosophers, like, have you talked a lot to your colleagues about the idea of being a public intellectual? And I feel like this really brings in what you're doing in your book, like speaking to the general public. Do you feel like philosophy, and specifically in the humanities, like how do you talk to your colleagues or your community about the importance of speaking to the public? Because I feel like we're at this precipice right now where academics are really trying to figure out how do they speak to the public and how do they convince them, which we could argue about the merits of needing to convince the public about the importance of the humanities, but like why it's so important to just talk to those who are outside the academy about these really deep humanistic principles. Why does anything exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? I think that's a question we all, as curious people, have asked ourselves. And let me tell you, Professor Stephen A. Simon's new book is so thought provoking that I can't wait for you all to pick it up. He provides his experience as a professor of political science and philosophy to explore that question with such a variety of perspectives from science, religion, philosophy, and even mathematics. He helps us understand what could possibly explain the most fundamental fact of all, that anything exists? So you can get this from broadviewpress.com. The floodgates have opened with science fiction as a genre in my life because I owe this to my husband and I'm going to give him credit. He has really gotten me to think more about sci-fi, film, and literature. I have to say, Minority Report, absolutely amazing. And Alien, I mean, who doesn't love that alien coming out of that human body in the first film? So, Professor Jason Haslam's new anthology provides a lot of exploration with all different short fiction, so many sci-fi authors, over 200 years, including sci-fi that explores indigenous futurism, feminist science fiction, Afrofuturism. Again, you can get this on broadviewpress.com. And last but not least, my upcoming episode with Professor Matthew James Vachinsky explores his book, which is Original Inquiry, A Guide to Research for Undergraduates, a great toolkit for all faculty out there who are just trying to find a book that helps their students understand how to collect research sources and then, right, the hardest part, build and organize their essay with all of these sources and to make a cohesive argument. I can't recommend Original Inquiry highly enough. So again, all three books can be found on broadviewpress.com. Use the promo code Ivory Tower for 20% off.
Are you a fan of classic Hollywood movies?
Are you a fan of queer cinema?
Then do we have the podcast for you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christian Garcia.
And I'm Luke Del Mar.
And we are your hosts of That Old Gay Classic Cinema, where we take a look at some of the greatest films of all time and analyze them through a queer theoretical lens.
Let's be honest. LGBTQIA plus people have been a part of Hollywood since its inception, and this podcast celebrates those artists and entertainers of yesteryear while also taking a closer look at the queer-coded characters and stories in classic Hollywood films long before queer representation entered the mainstream.
So follow us down the road of classic cinema as we give you a guide to some of the films that touched our hearts, brains, and even gave us courage to be ourselves.
You can listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok.
All right, listeners, we're ready for our close-up.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I just want to say one thing first on a positive note. Is that I have to say, and I assume this is the case at it's not only here, but at the University of Richmond. One of the things I love about being at a liberal arts college is the environment here. I feel like is so friendly to just the kinds of conversations where I love what I do, and I love doing it here, and it's an environment where I find the students here really are open to critical thinking and to engaging in the kinds of critical inquiry and reflective thinking and pressing for reasons are really open to that. And certainly feel like other faculty members are certainly, not only open to that, but very committed to it. So I really appreciate that, but I think you're raising an interesting question about, the openness to that kind of dialogue more generally. And can I just ask you a question real quick? Because I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I'd be interested to hear what kinds of things you have in mind when you're thinking about the resistance to critical thinking. I get the impression there might be particular contexts or particular manifestations that take that you have in mind, and I'm just interested to hear your thoughts about that.
I would say that the resistance, I think that it's twofold. In one vein, it could be conversations we're seeing with the public putting down academics, or there's been a really openly hostile conversation with academics, are in their ivory tower, don't have any connection to their communities, and only talk amongst themselves and only get read by each other, and their work isn't meant to be read by those out there. And then I just think it further fuels anti-intellectualism and successfully creates an anti-intellectual environment by trying to put an us versus them narrative out there. So I guess that's one thing. And then the other thing, what I would say is within the academy itself is the way that the administration's bureaucracy has kind of put this, a lot of academics don't get to do really humanistic thinking because their days are spent with committees, curriculum, and not really getting to be doing the mentoring with their students and with each other that allows for more collaborative thinking to happen because they just don't have time in their days with everything that's going on administratively.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, hearing you talk about that, I guess what I'm realizing is how much it matters what the context is that we're talking about or focusing on. Because like I was just saying, actually in my daily life, when I show up to work every day and the people I'm around and the students I'm around, sort of the water I'm most often directly swimming in is actually really friendly and enthusiastic about the kind of thing we're talking about. But obviously, yes, the things you're pointing out are very real. So I guess, I guess, one question about it, I guess, is why, why is there this? And since it's not the way I think, it's hard for me to speculate, but it does seem like part of it is the practical emphasis on it is this baking any bread, right? Is this actually accomplishing anything? Is it just people having conversations for the sake of having conversations? Is it ultimately a waste of time? And obviously, you and I very strongly don't think that it is, but I suspect that that's partly where the pushback comes from. Is, hey, I need a job when I'm done with this. You and I are both in university settings, and it's an understandable impulse, right? When I'm done with all this, I need to go out and make a living, and there may be some misimpressions about the extent to which there's a tension between the kind of critical thinking we're talking about and being practical. And without going on and on about it, I actually think that there are many ways that those two things are not in tension at all. And I actually think that there are many. This is very very vague and abstract, but I think there are actually many situations, many ways, many contexts in which being more reflective, engaging in more critical thinking, pausing to ask why, really trying to understand your own thought better, how the reasons in your own thinking connect is very practical, and actually far from being in tension with it is actually in the long run likely to lead you to more practical outcomes than people might suspect.
This episode is brought to you by Starbucks.
That is fire.
Whoa,
That's good.
this might be the drink of the summer.
Okay, I like this one too. I'm rocking with it. Okay.
Try it for yourself. Starbucks Refreshers Concentrates are coming home. Find them in the coffee aisle and make it yours.
And I also think that, I mean, I'm thinking of this work that was done by Randy Weingarten. I'm not sure if you saw her book, but she has this book called Why Fascists Fear Teachers. But it's like what you're kind of saying is like, yes, like we can look around in the news and like I just saw there was a school board that like voted down a marching band in Wisconsin the band in the high school from playing a piece because the piece, even though it doesn't have lyrics, like emanates from the Stonewall Revolution. And like the board made it into this indoctrination um, trying to like turn the students into being accepting around the LGBT community. And it's just like the parents and the students were outraged, but it's like there are board members who've been put into place to really fuel this like falsity of indoctrination or really engage in culture war issues. But like, I don't think the public believes that this is happening, but there are those who are trying to legally justify, I guess, this type of narrative that fuels a really uh, unintellectual, but really fuel a type of thinking that continues to do an us versus them, like a divide and conquer strategy, I would say. So, like, do you think that it's helpful though to have like philosophers and other public, scholars front and center coming out with works that like question the ethics of AI, right? Like I've seen a lot of books now doing that. Question, what's going on to spread and fuel anti-intellectual arguments. Like, do you think that that's where academics are winning in the case that they are getting these works out there? Like, are they helping change and counter these very disingenuous arguments?
Um, Andrew, can we take a 2 minute break?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry to do that, but since you said before that it's not, you
No,
don't
no, no, no,
sort
no.
of
Go
record
ahead.
the
Go
whole
ahead.
thing live.
Yeah.
Can I just be back in a minute and a half?
Yes, yes,
And
absolutely.
Okay, great. Thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no,
Appreciate it. I'll
no
be right
problem.
back.
Stephen. There you go. But yeah, so basically to reframe, like, how do you weigh in on like so much of academics now being in trade presses, getting more work out there to the mainstream public, like through podcasts, through books, that do you think that it's effective and it is helping counter these more, I guess, radical or just very false types of disinformation, like these disinformation campaigns that are happening?
Yeah, well, what I can say is so I think what you're doing is really very much the kind of thing that we need more of, and that I think is so healthy and productive and more and in general, yeah, I with an exclamation point, yes, I think that um books and conversation and dialogue between from between and the academics with the public is so important, partly because I think, like we were talking about before, I think a lot of discourse in the realm of those terms intimidate people. They put some people in some academia and philosophy, and they feel so weighty. But I think that it's very possible to make these topics just feel like something that really everybody is thinking about anyway, and just giving it a space for people to reflect on a lot of questions that they're already talking about anyway. I think it's very healthy and very productive to have that kind of discussion, and I think that there are one of the skills or abilities that I really value in people and in intellectuals is when they are able to articulate things in a way that someone can understand and engage with and find fun and rewarding without necessarily having a huge background in it. And I think that it's challenging, but I think it's a really fun challenge to try to. Actually, one of the things I love about teaching and about the kind of things we do and writing is the challenge of being able to say something to someone else
Mm.
really forces you to understand it on a deeper level than you thought. And there's actually something about trying to say something in a way that is digestible to someone who doesn't have a big background in something actually requires a deeper understanding than you think. I find that challenge really rewarding of like what's really going on here? Let's get how can I there can be so many thoughts in your head, so many moving pieces. It can feel so complex and complicated, like some kind of Rube Goldberg machine. But
Yeah.
then when you ask yourself, well, wait a minute, what am I actually saying here? What
Yeah.
what really is the question here? I think that can be so enriching.
Well, and that's why I think the Socratic method really, that kind of, I mean, something I really value is like you said, Stephen, like getting from students, really understanding like where they're weighing in on, say, I'm teaching Macbeth, weighing in on what themes they're finding really interesting, following up with their points, like letting them guide that conversation, and then our job to step in and just like do more of a deeper dive with them in a critical way. Like to me, that's really what the value of the humanities is to give space and time to really deeply think. And I love when students say, like, after taking a course with me, that they see TV, film, digital media, social media, like they're asking questions of it now that they didn't. It's like just turning that light switch on. And it's something that happens in our daily lives. It doesn't have to happen in the space of the classroom. And if anything, I always think the most intellectual work is done outside of the classroom. It's done like when we're just in our own thoughts and thinking. And consuming art or consuming any kind of material. But, I know that with your students in a seminar, like that's what really helped you gain an idea of how you were going to structure your book. Why does anything exist? So like I was just curious, like how did you approach that seminar? Like, can you give us a little insight into what that looked like when you were teaching why does anything exist to your college students? Looking for summer reads, The Gay and Lesbian Review, a bi-monthly magazine that features arts and culture conversations about the LGBT community, has you covered. The July and August issue is all about summer getaways and artists. So, for example, there are articles about David Hockney. There's an article about the sculpture in Central Park that some of you, if you've seen Angels in America, definitely recognize, by Emma Stebbins. So I can't wait for you all to get your hands on this issue. As always, there are TV reviews, film reviews, book reviews, theater reviews. So if you just don't know where to begin with LGBTQ literature, this is a great magazine to inspire you to add more books to your to be read pile. I love the Gay and Lesbian Review, and I'm so happy because I have a promo code for you. Go to glreview.org and get the print subscription or the digital subscription and put in ITBR choice for a free issue of the magazine.
Welcome to Severed, a podcast week dropping new episodes every Monday. Severed True Crime and Severed Paranormal episodes deep dive into murder, mysteries, and the otherworldly in a concise format. A 7-minute story to frame the case with thoughtful analysis and our usual banter.
We sometimes find the lighter side of darker cases. We offer 3 spin-off shows, Severed Strange Stories, Severed Haunted You, and Severed Serial Killers that highlight the unusual to lighthearted topics from the digital dumpsters of true crime, haunted universities, and the minds of madness like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer.
We are your co-hosts. I'm Harry Chambers.
And I'm Drew Hudson. Listen on all major podcast platforms, including Rogue Media Network and Radio Garden State. Follow us on Instagram at severed_podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll give this as kind of a mantra I have in a lot of my classes, but it just seems fitting here. So I'll say, which is, I find it really useful to think in terms of questions, possible answers, and arguments for those possible answers. And I find that for me, that's very simplistic, but I just find that way of thinking about things helps me get my hand around things that might otherwise feel like they're flying all over the place and what's going on here. I find that very grounding. And so I feel that way in this setting too, because it can feel like there's, so many thinkers and this huge history of this topic. Like where would you even begin? But if you just begin with, well, what's the question? Let's talk about the question. What makes the question interesting, important, challenging? And so I like to start by sitting with the question for a minute, and also asking people what are some of the most basic or recurring questions that you find yourself thinking about. Just kind of getting the juices flowing that way. What are some of the things you're the most curious about? And I feel like once you start doing that, even people who might not have described themselves as philosophical it'll turn out when they start thinking about it, it's like, yeah, actually there are some things I've always wondered about. And then in this, in this case, the question was, something along the lines of, why is there anything at all? Which feels like, at first can feel like a ridiculous question, but one way I like to think about it is, I was sort of mentioning this before, I find very interesting pushing reasons back and back. It's the old cliche of the kid who keeps asking why, why is the sky blue? Well, then why is this and why is that? But I feel like that's a very natural tendency, or it certainly is for me, that if you ask a question, you get a reason, And then you want to say, okay, but well, what's the reason for that? Right? And then you get a reason for that. And it's like, okay, but what's the reason for that? And it feels like it's kind of like the going out to space. Is there a stopping point? It's actually the same question. I don't know. Is there a stopping point? But at some, is there some ground? Is there some place, bedrock, right, where you can't go any deeper? And it's no, look, stop asking. It's here. This is it. You're not going to get any deeper than that. You can't go below that. That's it. That's the bedrock. And so with that in that spirit, I then like to think of it, well, what are possible answers to the question of why is there anything at all? What is possible bedrock? What form, if there is a bedrock, what form could that bedrock take? And at first it seems very mysterious, but then a way I like to think about it is, well, wait a minute. Forget about, all the big fancy, just in everyday life. What are the kinds of explanations that you're willing to accept in some situations? So let's start with what could possibly be the ultimate explanation, right? The most basic kind of explanation. Well, what are the candidates? The candidates might be some of the things that we accept as explanations for some things. And it seems to me that some of the kinds of explanations that are most familiar to us are, for example, mathematics, right? Like we all understand the idea of I need, just basic arithmetic, basic subtraction. Why is, and we accept mathematical explanations. We take it for granted. And science is another type of explanation that we take for granted. And there are at least two others that I think are very that we're so familiar with that they're easy to overlook. But in everyday life, another kind of an explanation is based in value or goodness. So in other words, like, why did you enjoy that? To use the movie example again, why did you enjoy that movie so much? Well, it was because it made me laugh, right? And so or why did you take that job rather than another job? Well, it's because I found it rewarding in some way. So there are some kinds of questions that where we will find an explanation that comes in the form of something good or valuable as satisfying. And then another one is, how am I able to raise my hand right now? And this might sound a little odd because it's so familiar, but the reason that I'm able to raise my hand is because of what you might call personal intention. In other words, that's a kind of explanation we accept is if a person wants to do something, they can do it. So those are at least four possible explanations that could be the ultimate explanation. Mathematics, science, value or goodness, meaning some people say, why does anything exist? Because it's good. Why does the world exist? Because it's good that it do so. And the thing about personal intention is actually, even though people don't think of it in this language, that's actually a religion or theism. In other words, the explanation that many people accept as the ultimate explanation is the reason that anything exists or the reason that the world exists is because God wanted it to. God created it. And that's essentially, it's obviously we're not gods, but it's in the same category as the explanation is because someone willed it to be the case, right? I can will my hand to go up. And again, it's not the same thing. I can't make something come out of nothing, but that's another type of explanation would be, well, maybe there's a supernatural being who has powers well beyond what we have. But ultimately, the nature of the explanation is God willed it into being. So anyway, that was a very long answer.
No, I think it's fascinating because even the example of like raising your hand, it also shows like the power of your work that it relies on this interdisciplinary aspect, like where mathematics, science, religion, right? Like we could even get into free will versus like the ancient Greeks believing in fate controlling your destiny. Like I talk about that a lot when I teach Antigone. how like Antigone and Creon are going up against each other, like one being more in line with thinking about the gods and their will, the other thinking more that he can control destiny and control people's lives. And I think it's really interesting because like if you're raising your hand, like my mind goes to, well, is that something I'm willing or is that something like my brain is automatically, you know, the chemistry of my brain wants that to happen. So then it's like a physical process. And it kind of like goes back to the like nature versus nurture. Like, how much of what we do is dependent on biology, how much of it is dependent on our social conditions. And, I think what keeps us asking these questions is there is no one answer. Like, there is no one specific side where we can fall, even though we have all these scientific principles that exist. Like, we still don't know what happens to us after we die. And we have so many theories about it. And like, anytime I try to think about what happens to my essence after I die, my mind just whirls around and around and it becomes like a black hole of just what is going on with that question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so like you said, one of the things I find really interesting in tying in with what you're saying is like when you were saying like when I raise my hand, what's going on, right? So everyone can see a hand going up, but what's the real story there? And one way of thinking about it is like you're saying, it's just science. Like, what are you even talking about? Like, there's, I don't know about science to pull it off, but there's neurons firing, and there's some soup of electrical chemicals, right? It's just all physical stuff, right? It's ultimately just quarks and electrons that are following the physical rules. That's all there is. Like anything beyond that, like I don't want to hear about it, right? Because now you're just being superstitious. But there's another way of looking at things that, well, maybe not everything. Maybe not everything can be explained by the rules about quarks and electrons. And some people would say, well, there's something about, like you were mentioning, free will. It's very hard to reconcile free will with the mechanical laws of science. And so some people would want to say, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe we don't exactly know how this would happen, but maybe there's something about our nature that allows us to freely will something. And that there's obviously I need muscles and bones to make the arm go up. I can't do it just through my will. But at the beginning of it, is there some little spark that starts that process that's not fully capturable by just, in a mathematical formula that's a physical equation?
Yeah, well, and like when you read literature, like when you read fiction, say, for example, Stephen, do you look at it like in the way of you're looking at it and analyzing it for plot, or are you looking at it more as the questions that it asks? Like, I'll give an example. So, in my world lit, I usually end with Wicked, just because like of the phenomenon of it. It's a really like great, quick read. I interviewed Gregory Maguire about it, and I feel like it's a fascinating novel about what wickedness is and like how it can be propaganda could be used to turn people against others and scapegoated. But like when she dies at the end of the novel, the witch, and if you it's not a spoiler because you have the Wizard of Oz, but like
Right.
she's literally like the voice of the novel. And then like my students always say, well, when she dies, how can he continue this novel with like a character who's now died? And it's like, well, her essence is just dispersed. And it's like a really deep thought because, well, what do you do when a novel ends with like the protagonist's death and then you're still supposed to continue reading knowing that this has happened? Like, how do you approach, say, fiction, like as someone who's so deeply into existential or philosophical inquiry? Like, do you see it just as, something to enjoy because of the plot, or is there always like something else you're asking of it?
Yeah, that is such a rich question. I don't even know where to start. But just a couple things, and then I definitely want to
Yeah.
ask your thoughts on that. Is particularly given your expertise. But one thing that comes to mind in hearing your question is it seems like there's something about narrative, right, that is so wired into us. Like in thinking about like foundations, like where does that come from? Like why is it? It seems like you know more about this field than I do, but it just sort of just every day, it just seems like every culture, everywhere, people forever have been right as long as there've been as long as people have been writing this fascination with stories
Mm.
and why. And I do think it fits in with the why does anything exist question because there's it seems like there's a sense in which we use stories in some way to make sense of things. And we want some kind of overarching narrative story for our own lives to see how we fit into things. We just use that to make sense of things. Um, and but the question you're asking is really interesting is like what do one thing I heard for what you're saying is like what do we want from a story? Like what are we hoping to get out of it? What are we looking for? Right? Is it just in a is it just escape? Like I just want to have fun. I just want to forget about my life for a minute. Don't bother me with any ideas. I just want to have fun. I just want to be in the moment. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. It's like going on a roller coaster ride. It's
Yeah.
really cool and cathartic and awesome. Um, or are you looking for that, or in addition to maybe something that's going to make you see something differently or empathize with a point of view that like there's so many different things you could be looking for from narrative, from a story. And I think that's really interesting. And I can't resist asking you,
Yeah.
Andrew, since this is like, how do you think about that? Like, do you feel like there's like do you feel like there's like what do you have like a main idea of what narrative or what stories are about, or do you feel like it's like very much depends on the person or the book, or like how do you think about that?
Yeah, I feel like each genre asks a different question of the reader. I mean, I would say like what attracts me to narratives is just that archetypal. Like I feel like almost all narratives, they have deep mythological resonances. Like, why do we really enjoy adventure tales or fairy tales? It's like because of these, or the Odyssey, right, is about to come out in this really epic film version, which I can't wait for. And I think like these tales are so interesting because it's like almost every heroic character, Dorothy, Odysseus, Alice, Peter Pan, I don't know, right? We could keep going on, is Star Wars. They all share that same need to like return home or to discover, to face obstacles, those trials and tribulations. And I think like a deep part of literature is immersing yourself into escaping. And that's another thing is I think sometimes that idea of escapism gets, like you've said, kind of a bad rap. But really, to me, escapism is about us putting ourselves into scenarios and situations that hopefully we won't be subjected to, and you kind of get to live this alternative life. Um, in that comfort of not having to encounter these difficulties and ending that journey by discovering maybe a different aspect of yourself that, or questioning something and teaching yourself something that you didn't know before beginning that book. I mean, at least that's what I love about the power of literature. I think it does allow for that. And it doesn't matter if it's something of smut or romance or something that's like a deep, um, epic text. I think each text will do that in different ways.
Yeah, one thing that you just said that really struck me and makes me think about it a little differently is like the idea of escape. I feel like sometimes the word escape has almost a negative connotation of like you can't stand the heat, so you got to get out, right? I got to escape. I can't deal with this, so I got to get away. Whereas I think you were kind of flipping that on its head and saying, well, if you escape, you're going into something else. And so you can actually think of it as a brave or daring or adventurous thing to do because you're leaving a known familiar place and going into something new, which I think is a
Well,
cool way of thinking about it.
yeah, and like I was so curious about, you know, how are you thinking right now about the advancement of technology? Like, are you like, I sent this text to you, but I'm so curious to read Open Socrates because I feel like it's asking these. I mean, there's so many books now asking about, how do we still have our human essence when you feel like AI and other things are trying to, optimize is the word that they keep using, the technocrats, but are trying to just create these like productive citizens. What does that mean for the creative arts and thinking? How are you weighing in on all of these technological questions right now?
Yeah, I feel like so like you and like so many other people right now, I also find these questions absolutely riveting. And just since we're talking about narrative and stories, like how many stories are about exactly that question and have been, way before ChatGPT, there have been sci-fi, Blade Runner and just, going, one after another, Ex Machina more recently, you
Mhm.
know, so much art and literature and film dealing with this question of what's the essence of is there an essence to us that can't be captured by by science and techno or by technology. Yeah, and in turn, so just want to say I'll say one thing about AI, but I guess just to take a half a step back first, I do feel very aware of the fact that this is probably something that's come up over and over. Like probably so often when new technologies are introduced, there's a certain part of the population that's really nervous about it and is, what is this? So there's in itself, there's nothing new about that, but it does sure feel like there's something new about AI. And I'm not an expert in this field to be able to sort it out, but one thing that I do feel like ties in with something that I think about a lot in teaching that we were kind of talking about before is like one thing that I think is that I really value in critical inquiry and so forth is the the idea that you learn more about yourself. You learn in forcing yourself or in asking yourself to think about what do I believe and what are the reasons for the things I believe and so forth. I think we often can really learn something about our own thinking. You might even have beliefs you didn't realize you had because you haven't had the time and bandwidth to stop and think about it. This is one of my favorite things in teaching is seeing students who might have that kind of light bulb moment where they'll realize, you know what, I actually do have an opinion about that question. And I never really recognized it. It's like in there somewhere, but it never got the microphone. It never got a chance to. But now that I'm sort of pausing to, the flow, ebb and flow of everyday life is honest. We don't have time. But now that I've actually stopped thinking about it, I think I do have an opinion about that. And now that I realize that I do have that opinion, now I see why I've always been drawn to this other thing or why I've always found that offensive because and I think there's something really cool about kind of better understanding the architecture of your own thought and your own, not that everything fits together perfectly or that you're going to have it all sorted out or you're going to have a treatise on, but just learning a little bit more about some of the things that might make you think and do some of the things that you do. So I think why talking about AI took me to that, I think, is because I do think that's one of the potential downsides of AI is that if if we rely too much on AI, instead of I'm not gonna write this paragraph, I'm not gonna write this essay myself by having to think through what, but I'm just gonna put in the query, right? And then it's gonna pop out an answer and I'll. that I think there's so much that goes on in the process of thinking things through for yourself that you learn about yourself that
Mm,
that's that's part of what's unique and individual to you, whereas AI is all in the other direction. It's all statistical. It's large language model. It's what's the most common, how what's the most statistically
mm.
likely thing to come after, and that seems like it's not not against the spirit of really learning about something that's unique and individual to your own thought.
Yeah. Well, as we're at the end, which I could just keep picking your brain, Stephen. This has been fascinating. And I hope you come back on again. We'll have to like think of another, hopefully another work you have out or, something else. There's always space here for you. What was it like, with your readers with Why Does Anything Exist? Like, why was it so important, or what did it teach you to bring all of these disciplines together? Because I feel like so much of the time, the science, mathematics, the STEM fields get pitted against humanities and vice versa. Like, as you show, all of these fields rely on one another for deep thinking. So, like, what was it like bringing these disciplines together?
Yeah, one thing that question makes me think of is intellectual humility, which I think is really important, and I think it's one way that I think that sort of thinking about like big questions like why does anything exist, which can feel very exotic and far from everyday life. But I think it does have an important lesson, which is about the limits of our understanding, and that um, that there are ways in which we try to understand things as well as we can, but at a certain point, it becomes very difficult to make all of the pieces fit, to come up with a worldview where you have answers to everything. It's very difficult to do from any perspective. So I don't think there's any answer to the question, to the most basic questions where everything seems to fit perfectly and you don't have any difficulties left. And so one of the things that I find so fascinating about grappling with this kind of material is thinking of it in terms of like what's the appeal, what are the advantages of approaching certain topics from a certain perspective, but then also what are some of the vulnerabilities. So
Mm,
science, for example, offers so much, right? I mean, it's, I don't need to convince anybody of that. It offers so much. But when you think about it as a as a complete worldview, as an explanation for everything, I won't run through this. I talk about this in the
yeah, yeah,
book,
yeah.
but there are reasons that even the world's greatest physicists would admit, yeah, that's really tough for science to explain. And and I think that's true of all of the different basic kinds of explanations. And so I find it really enriching finding that middle space where on the one hand, we don't pretend to understand more than we really do. That we're humble, candid about the fact that there are big questions we'd love to know the answer to, but we don't really have it all sorted out. But also on not going all the way to the other side of saying, well, therefore, forget it. Why even bother with this? That
Mm,
there's so much to be gained from understanding the options better, the candidates. What are the different kinds of explanations? What do they offer? What are their potential vulnerabilities? And so I think there's a tremendous amount to be gained from that. And just a last point on that. Another thing I really find rewarding about this this topic, or this field, or whatever you want to call it, this inquiry into why does anything exist, is you end up running into and asking yourself other questions that are really interesting in themselves, but that are very interrelated. So, for example, how much should we trust common sense? Like when you're confronted with a question or you hear a possible answer to something, a possible explanation, and you're kind of that intuition, that like your stomach, your gut feeling is like, wait a minute, that sounds kind of crazy. That sounds weird. Like, does that matter? Should we trust that? if you hear an explanation that in many ways seems to have a lot of force to it, but just something about it seems weird, how much does it count against the next? So anyway, that's just an example of, because that's a question you could confront in other parts of your life too, like how much should I trust my own common sense? And so I think that the way that engaging with that huge question of why does anything exist, along the way, you end up engaging with lots of other questions that I think are also really interesting in and of themselves.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's a great lesson in one question leads to multiple questions. There's not just one question. And I mean, that's philosophy in a nutshell. I mean, I think it's what fascinates me about philosophy. Well, I was so happy to have you on, Stephen. So, everyone, broadviewpress.com, why does anything exist? There's a promo code Ivory Tower for 20% off. I can't wait for you all to read it. It is for, as you could tell from this conversation, it's going to have you ask many, many questions about your life. And I just am so happy that you put it out here in the universe, Stephen. Thank you for your book, for your thoughts, for your work, and, for coming here on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This was so much fun. I really loved it, and I love so much the spirit of this conversation and what you do in general, of just having really cool conversations wherever they might end up. You might not have even anticipated when you started. This was super fun. I really appreciate it, Andrew. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, bye to you. Bye to everyone out there, and let's keep asking the hard questions.